Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for this very gracious and generous introduction. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to give a presentation at the Office of Population Research. So let me share my screen. Let's see. You should be able to see my screen and hear me. If not, just say something. All right. So today I'm going to talk about measuring and understanding migration of scholars, and I'm going to provide some evidence from bibliometric data. So I have to say that initially I was a little bit undecided about which topic I would present. I had essentially two main options. Option one was to present something that is a sort of line of work that is a little bit more consolidated. And option two was to present something that is very much a work in progress. And so in the end, I decided to go for option two, as I think that it would be, there is so much intellectual capacity in this virtual room that it would be wonderful to get some feedback on some work that is at an early stage when feedback would be most valuable. And I also thought that it would be more interesting and fun for you to see some results that have not been shown anywhere else before. So if you have questions or clarifications throughout the presentations, please feel free to interrupt me. I will not be able to monitor the chat, but just sort of jump in and I'll be happy to sort of clarify things along the way. Otherwise, there will be time at the end for questions. Now, before I start, I would like to acknowledge a group of people who made major contributions to this project. They include Ali Akbariktawar, who is a researcher at MPIDR, Andrea Miranda Gonzalez, a PhD student in demography at UC Berkeley, Sami Naref, previously at the Institute, now assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Ebru Sanliturk, a researcher at the Institute, Maciej Danko, a statistical analyst at the Institute, Tom Tyler, who is a software developer, and Shinit Zhao, who is a PhD student at MPIDR. I'm greatly indebted to all of them for their work and for their enthusiasm. So this is part of a seminar series that is named after Frank Notestein, who is widely recognized as an architect of modern demography. And so I would like to start with him. When you read Notestein's biography, you learn that he went to graduate school at Cornell University, and then he spent some time in Europe, in London, in Frankfurt, in Geneva, before returning to the US, where he took a post at the Milbank Memorial Fund. Up until 1936, that's when he became the founding director of the Office of Population Research at Princeton University. He had a huge impact on the discipline and more broadly on scientific advancement. Now, scholars more broadly are a group of innovators and institution builders whose work make important contributions to our societies. And when it comes to migrants, in particular, to both origin and destinations. For someone like Frank Notestein, we can read his biography and we can learn about his transitions from one institution to another one. But we can also learn about his trajectory by looking at his papers and the metadata associated to his publications. So for example, if we look at this paper on fertility of the social classes, we can take a look at the metadata associated with it. And we can see that this paper was published in 1934. And at that time, Frank Notestein was at the Milbank Memorial Fund. Now, if we take another paper or another publication, we can see that in 1944, Frank Notestein was affiliated with the Office of Population Research at Princeton University. And so we can infer that in between, he moved from the Milbank Memorial Fund to the Office of Population Research. Now, I'm showing you this because the main idea behind the type of project that I'm presenting today is very simple. So the key idea is that changes in institutional affiliations can be used to infer changes in residence over time at the individual level, as well as for population of scholars, with a little bit of approximation, but it's quite simple. Now, this idea would well remain an idea without any data. But the recent and increasing availability of bibliometric data makes this idea also a scalable idea. In particular, for the type of work that I'm presenting today, we will rely on the SCOPUS database, which is one of the major citation and abstract databases. It covers more than 77 million publications written by more than 16 million authors associated with more than 70,000 affiliations. Now, this is proprietary data. We did have access to this data through the Max Planck Digital Library and the German Competence Center for Bibliometrics. That is essentially a network of organizations of which the Max Planck Society is part, with some interest in science, and so they do facilitate access to this type of data and resources that are updated on a continuous base. So one of the initial goals of this project is to estimate and understand migration of scholars, so to get some sense of flows of scholars over time and across regions, both at the micro and macro levels. And among others, we're interested in assessing whether what has been often referred to as the brain drain is really an issue, or is not an issue, or perhaps under what circumstances. And more broadly, we would like to tie that to a better understanding of the relationship between migration of scholars and societal transformations that happen with economic development. So here is an outline of what I'm going to present today. First, I'm going to give a little bit of background on the data. Then I will provide some descriptive or illustrative statistics on some of the things that we can and we did estimate. And those include estimates for internal and international migration of scholars. And finally, I will talk about relationships between migration of scholars and development, including the role of return migration. So let me start with a little bit of background on the data. So this is an example of the type of data that we used. In particular, this is metadata about a number of publications that are associated to me as an author and that are indexed by Scopus. So if we look at this table, we do have each row is one publication, and we have 4 columns. The first column is my uniquely identifying author ID within the Scopus database. The second column indicates the name of the author and the affiliation. The third column is the year of publication for all these publications. And the last column is the country associated with the main affiliation. So if you look at this data, For example, if you look at year and country over time, you would see, for example, that say in 2015, 2016, and 2017, my publications were in the US, or as I was affiliated with the University of Washington in Seattle. Then starting from 2018, you'll see that some of my publications were categorized as US and others Germany, and afterwards it's Germany as I moved to the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research in Rostock. So with this type of data, we can infer changes in residence based on changes in affiliation. I'm also showing you this specific table to give you a sense of the type of noise that we have in this data and the types of issues that come with this data. So for example, if you look at this row over here, for this publication, for some reason, there is the name of the author, but there's no affiliation. So there's some missingness. We can't say anything about the affiliation associated and the country associated to this publication. And there is one interesting case here where there is my name, but my affiliation is incorrect. So essentially it says that I'm affiliated with the Qatar Computing Research Institute in Doha. So there is a reason for this. This is a type of publication. These are sort of chapters in conference proceedings for which Scopus only reports the affiliation of the first author. The first author for that specific publication was my co-author Ingmar Weber, who is based at the Qatar Computing Research Institute. And so essentially there is a mistake in the data here. But we are aware of that issue with those types of publications. And so in the data preprocessing phase, we removed all those data that come from that type of publication. Then there are other cases where we have the affiliation, but not the full address. So for example, this is Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, but based just on this information, we can't tell where this institution is located. We don't have the full address, so we can't say that it's Germany. And then there are cases where there's more than one affiliation. So for a couple of publications, there is both University of Washington and Max Planck Institute. So in this case, what is taken by Scopus is what is reported as the main affiliation. In this case, it was the University of Washington, and so it was US. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of the type of data that we're using. So one important aspect of working with this data is data quality. And that is one of the main reasons why we decided to use the Scopus database instead of its main competitor, which is Web of Science. In particular, Scopus is widely recognized as being the best database in terms of author name disambiguation, meaning that Scopus is particularly good at being able to distinguish authors that are separate authors, but that share the first and last name. So people with the same name, but that are different people. In particular, there are two important metrics. The first metric is associated to precision, which tells us that more than 98% of author profiles do not include publications that are written by someone else. And the second metric is related to completeness of this data. It says that more than 90% of author profiles include all publications that have been written by that author. So author disambiguation is a major component, and that's why we chose Scopus. The second component is organization disambiguation. Different organizations come with different abbreviations or different types of acronyms and so on. Fortunately, there is a large network of institutions that have contributed to producing a research organization registry that can be accessed via an API. And so we use that to disambiguate institutions. So for example, if we have only the name of the institution, say Max Planck Institute for Demography Research. By using this API, we can retrieve all the other types of information like the address, the country, and so on. So it helps us also with missingness. Finally, we focused on the subset of the data with the highest quality. So this means that we focused on the period that started in 1996. That's because starting from 1996, we have the best data quality in terms of both author disambiguation and institutional affiliations. And we focus on two types of publications that are articles and reviews, because those are the highest quality data in terms of metadata within Scopus. So in the end, we are left with a little bit over 36 million publications that we consider for this project. Now, once we have this data, then the next step is to identify migration events. And I'm going to give you a couple of illustrative examples based on a timeline of events. So let's consider a sort of hypothetical scholar whose name is Maria. So for Maria, we observe first publications with a Canadian affiliation in 1998. Most of our publications, or all of our, most or all of our publications are with a Canadian affiliation, and so we assign Canada as the country of residence for 1998. So more broadly, the country of residence is chosen as the model country of publications for that specific year. For Maria, we also consider Canada as the country of academic birth. So essentially the country where she was trained or where she started publishing. But we do not know anything about her citizenship or actual country of birth. So we consider the country of origin is the country where the person started publishing. Then we follow the person over time, and we can see that Maria published in Canada for a number of years, and then starting from 2002, her residence changed, or her country of affiliation changed to the US. And so we infer that between 2001 and 2002, Maria changed residence from Canada to the US. Now, this is one example. We could have a slightly different example. That's sort of like another hypothetical scholar. His name is Joe. We have information starting from 1996. He published in Canada, Canada, and then we have a gap. So when we have a gap, what we do is that we impute the country values if the gap is up to 2 years by using the closest observations on each side. And so we use essentially backward or forward filling. So in this case, we impute Canada for 1999, we impute US for 2000, and we infer that Joe moved from Canada to the US between 1999 and 2000. Now, one thing that I would like to point out that is a limitation of this data that should be considered is that for a person like, for a profile like Joe's profile, we may have a left truncation issue. So essentially, we observe data starting from 1996, but we don't know whether what Joe did before. For example, he could have started publishing in the early 1990s or in the late 80s, and we would know that information. Or it could be the case that Joe started publishing in 1996. We cannot know just based on the data that we have. So this is something that we always need to be aware of when we look at this data. All right, so that was some sort of general background on the type of data that we have. Now I would like to show some descriptive statistics on both internal and international migration to give you a sense of what we can estimate with this data. So I'm going to start with an example related to Mexico. In particular, I wanted to point out that my previous examples were related to international migration, but in terms of affiliations, we do have essentially the city where people are affiliated, where the institution is associated with. And so we can also use the same approach to assess internal migration from states to states, or from or within macro regions like the north, the center, or the Pacific coast for the case of Mexico. So for this specific case of Mexico, we started by taking a look at a standard indicator, the CRUDE migration intensity, which essentially has on the numerator all the migration events within a macro demographic region, and on the denominator all the number of active scholars within that region. And what we saw was that for a region like Mexico City, there's been a slight decline, but the trend has been fairly, the CRUDE migration intensity has been almost constant over time. Whereas for most of the other regions, we see a decline in the CRUDE migration intensity over time. And this is also related to the increasingly important role of Mexico City within the sort of system of migration of the country as a whole. As a matter of fact, if we take, for example, all the flows within Mexico, these are the 32 states of Mexico, it's immediately visible that Mexico City plays a central role. So essentially, about a quarter of all flows that happen internally in Mexico involve Mexico City, either as a sending region or as a receiving region. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this data is that it also allows us to assess the connectedness of regions within one country and other countries. So within it helps us to connect the internal and international dimension. So this chart shows flows over the whole period for regions in Mexico, and in particular Mexico City, which is the center of migration, international migration of scholars in Mexico, to other subnational regions, but not necessarily in Mexico. And so we see that Mexico City is highly connected with regions like California in the US, Bogota in Colombia, Catalonia and Madrid in Spain, Ile-de-France, that's the region of Paris, as well as states like Texas, New York, and Massachusetts in the US, or Havana in Cuba. So this data set is very rich, and it allows us to connect both the internal migration and international migration, and the subnational dimension with the international dimension. Now, of course, we can also zoom out and look at international migration and trends over time. In particular, this chart shows emigration rates from Mexico to the top 5 destination countries. So on the y-axis, we have rates per 1,000 scholars over time between 2000 and 2017. So say if we take one data point, say USA in 2003, on the numerator, we would have the number of scholars who moved from Mexico to the US in 2003. That's the numerator. And on the denominator, we would have the number of active scholars in Mexico in 2003. So we would have like people who move and the exposure. So if we look at this chart, we see that migration rates from Mexico to the US in terms of scholars have been declining over time. And we sort of like plateauing towards the end. There's been a rapid decline at the beginning, around between 2000 and 2005, and then things have been sort of slowing down. The second major destination country from Mexico is Spain. There, the trend has been a little bit more constant with a slight decline. Other major destinations include France, Great Britain, and Canada. Now, so far, I have focused on Mexico, but there's no reason to focus only on Mexico. We can look at a number of other countries. Let's take, for example, the United States. This is the same type of visualization as before. It shows emigration rates from the US to the top 5 destination countries. And again, rates per 1,000 scholars. Now, what is really striking here to see is the rapid increase in out-migration rates from the US to China. This grew from about 0.4 per thousand in 2000 to values at around 1.5, 1.6 by the end of 2017. So while we saw this rapid increase for out-migration to China, we also saw a slow decrease in out-migration towards other main destinations from the US. Those include Canada, Great Britain, Japan, and Germany. So this has been sort of a gentle decline over time. Now, I mentioned China. We can also look at things from the other perspective. We can look at things from the Chinese perspective. So this is the same type of visualization that shows emigration rates from China to the top 5 destination countries. The top 5 destination countries are the US, Japan, Germany, Canada, and here we also have like Hong Kong that is classified as one of the regions. They show a similar trend, so a fairly rapid decline in early 2000, and then a sort of more gentle decline later on. Now, I would like to point out that these are rates. So there's a decline in emigration rates from China to the US, but the flows from China to the US have been increasing. So the number of scholars who are moving from China to the US has been increasing over time, but at the same time, the size of the population of scholars in China has been growing very quickly. So essentially, the denominator has been growing at a faster rate than the numerator. And so if we measure things in terms of rates or propensity, the propensity has been going down, while the actual number of scholars who have been migrating from China to the US has been going up over time. So this brings me to other measures that can help us assess net gains or net losses. In particular, we can look at a measure, at a sort of standard measure, that is the net migration rate. So this chart shows net migration rates for 4 countries: US, China, Japan, and India. 0 is over here, that's the horizontal line. The US has been consistently above 0. So throughout the entire period, the US has received more scholars than it has sent to other countries, so is a net receiver of scholars. China was initially negative, then it has been hovering around 0, and at the moment is slightly positive. Japan and India have been sort of consistently below 0, so they've been net senders of scholars or of active scholars. If we look at another group of countries, we can look at the situation in Europe. These are 4 other countries: Spain, Germany, France, and Italy. It's the same quantity, net migration rate. This is the 0 line. We see that Spain used to be a net receiver, and then starting from around 2011, 2012, has become a net sender, probably as after economic crisis. Germany, that's the blue line over here, has been following the opposite path. It used to be a net sender, but more recently it has reached level of 0 in terms of net migration rates, and is likely to reach positive levels, to maintain positive levels in the near future. If we look at a country like France, that's the light blue line, that has been a net sender throughout the last couple of decades. Italy used to be close to 0 and has sort of observed a decline over time, and has been consistently sending out more scholars than it receives. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of the type of rates that we can generate, and the types of data that we have and that we can study. Now, I would like to move on to the third part of this presentation that sort of builds on this data that I've just described. In particular, for this last part, I would like to focus on the relationship between migration of scholars and development, including return migration. So more broadly, the key question here is whether economic development increases or reduces emigration of academic scientists. Now, we all know that there is an extensive literature on migration and development for entire populations, and many of the people in the audience here have contributed to development of these theories over the course of the last few decades, including explanations related to how economic development might displace labor from agrarian society. And so what we would observe is that in the short term, migration tends to increase, and then it decreases. Now, we also know that migration processes are highly heterogeneous, with different groups of people that may be sort of affected differently by economic development. And we do have some classical theories, including theories on high-skill migration, that may provide some guidance. On the one hand, there are theories that come from neoclassical approaches that focus on wage differentials. There are theories that stress the importance of relative deprivation and the comparison that people make with other people in their own country or people in the receiving country before making decisions on whether to migrate or not, as well as world systems theory that emphasizes structural changes that are associated with processes like globalization. Now, for this specific project, what we want to do is to focus on one specific group of migrants, that is active academic scientists. That's an important group. It's important for innovation and circulation of ideas. And as I've shown you in the past 20 minutes, we spent some time developing a good longitudinal data set that can help us assess various types of relationships. So in terms of statistical analysis, we use the generalized additive mixed model that essentially allows us to model nonlinear relationships using a series of penalized smooth functions. So what we do is that we consider the logarithm of emigration counts. We model them as a negative binomial with a negative binomial distribution. and as a function of smooth functions of logarithm of GDP, the year, as well as we consider random intercepts for countries, as well as random slopes with GDP for each country. This term is the offset term, is the exposure, the number of active scholars in the country of origin, and then we have an error term. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the details of the statistical model. Instead, I'm going to focus on a visualization of the data and the predictions. This figure shows emigration rates per 1,000 scholars on the y-axis with respect to GDP per capita on the x-axis. The box plots include the data. So the horizontal lines are the medians for each level of GDP, and the boxes are the indicate the interquartiles. We have two thick lines. The orange line shows the predictions from the model when we consider country random effects, and the blue line when we don't consider country random effects. And then you see very thin lines of different colors. Those are the predictions for individual countries based on their trajectories, since for each country we may observe only a limited period of change with GDP. Now, if you look at this figure, what we observe mainly is that as GDP increases, out-migration rate from each country to all other countries tend to go down up to a level of $25,000 per capita in terms of GDP, and then we observe a reversal in the trends with migration that increases afterwards. So this is kind of like the mirror image of what we would expect for societies as a whole. So normally we would expect that migration goes up, and then after a certain level of economic development, it goes down. Now, this is potentially related to a number of things, including the expansion of the higher education sector with economic development and the number of opportunities that become available to scholars. It also indicates that countries, low and middle income countries, as they develop, they tend to sort of gain from their ability to sort of reduce the propensity of out migration. So this gives us some general trends. Now, one related question is whether those who migrate out of countries at different stages of development, whether they return to their countries, say 10 to 15 years later, or whether they're gone forever. And so we try to assess that question by essentially identifying return migration for one specific cohort. I'm going to give you a stylized example of how we identify return migration. And let's consider another timeline from 1996 to 2021. And here I consider a fictitious scholar whose name is Jenny. So for Jenny, we need to have no publications before 2000. So the reason why we include this criterion is that we want to minimize the issues related to left truncation. So it's still possible that Jenny might have published in the early 1990s and then she doesn't publish for a few years, but it's fairly unlikely. It's quite unlikely. So by removing, by having the constraint that she shouldn't have any publications before 2000, we're more confident that publications observed between 2000 and 2005 are her first publications. So she needs to have 3 consecutive years of publications in what we call country of origin. In this case, is Canada. Then she has to be a migrant after 2005. So she has to move anywhere else and spend 3 consecutive years anywhere else in the world. In this fictitious example, it's the UK, with a sort of short visit to the US. And then we look at what happens, say, 10 years after, when Jenny reaches or is close to reaching a peak of productivity. So we want to know whether she spends 3 consecutive years back in the country of origin. If that's the case, then we sort of classify Jenny as a return migrant. And in this case, the country of origin is Canada. Now, there could be a different example. John has a sort of similar trajectory, no publications before 2000, 3 consecutive publications in Canada, publishes elsewhere, but then never returns to Canada. So what we look at are essentially 2 quantities. So we consider those people who start in one country and move out of the country. And then we consider out of those people, how many of those, after sort of about 10 years, go back to the country of origin. And so I'm going to show you one map that includes sort of these ratios of scholars who return after spending at least 3 years abroad. So you see different colors here. Dark color means low ratio, so means low likelihood of returning, whereas light colors indicate higher likelihood of returning to the country of origin. And if you take a quick look at this map, you see that there is quite a bit of a divide between, say, high-income countries in the global north and low and middle-income countries, broadly defined in the global south. There could be many reasons why we observe that, and we haven't sort of fully investigated all of this. As a matter of fact, this figure was prepared like last week, as well as many other figures. So we're still trying to understand what's happening here. And if you have any feedback, it would be more than welcome. One sort of hypothesis is that if we take a country like the US, this is a country that trains people from many other countries. And so people who start their academic career in the US and then move elsewhere, perhaps are less likely to return to the US. Whereas, let's take Brazil. Maybe we can assume that people who are trained or people who start their academic career in Brazil are mostly Brazilians. Out of those who migrate, they may go to the US, they may go to Europe or elsewhere. Those people are much more likely to return to Brazil than, say, people who were trained in Europe and then go elsewhere. So broadly, this would indicate that for countries that are at a sort of low and middle income level, there is substantial level of circulation of scholars. So even those countries who train scholars are more likely to sort of have those scholars come back within the time frame of 10 to 15 years. So that combined with a sort of a reduction in out-migration rates with development would seem to indicate a potential virtuous cycle of development and a sort of level of brain circulation that would favor circulation of ideas and development, including in low and middle income countries. All right, so let me get back to the outline. I gave some background on the data at the beginning. Then I showed you some descriptive statistics on internal and international migration. And finally, I discussed some initial results on analysis on the relationships between migration and development, including return migration. Now, I would like to conclude by saying that part of this project, part of the goal is to sort of establish a new database that would allow us to understand academic migration, both at the micro and macro levels. And initial evidence shows that economic development does not increase the propensity of academic migration in low and middle income countries. It might actually decrease it and might potentially lead to a virtuous cycle where scholars may return 10 to 15 years later. Now, there is a lot more that can be considered. There's a gender dimension, the role of institutions, the role of networks of collaborators, how to link this database to additional data sources, and so on. And this is something that we plan to look at over the next several weeks and months. So with this, I would like to conclude here. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'd be very happy to hear from you and address any questions you might have.